Hello.
Hey
Hi,
there.
Derrick.
Hi there. How are you?
I am good. Thank you so much for joining me this frigid October evening. Um, Hello, everyone who is going to be joining us. We do recognize that tonight is a home Lions game, and we're hoping you aren't pre-gaming too hard yet as you're coming to join us on this live open discussion with Washtenaw County Sheriff candidate Derrick Jackson and myself, Nicole Beverly. For those of you who do not know me, I am a survivor of domestic violence, stalking, and multiple attempts by my ex-husband to hire individuals to kill me from prison. I also am an author of the book Finding Nicole, which is available on Amazon, BookBaby, and at other major retailers and local libraries. There's also a movie that has been made about my story, also titled Finding Nicole, that is in contract negotiations with distributors right now. And I know everyone always asks, like, when's the movie coming out? So I can let you guys know soon, but that's all I can say. That's all the details I have.
I just want
But
to
it
know,
is,
like, who's gonna play me in the movie? Because I know I'm gonna have like a small part or something, right?
I mean, maybe Denzel. What do you think?
That's not a bad.
Is
That's not a
that
bad choice. I can take it. I can
is
take it.
that like quality enough?
It's quality. Absolutely. Yes. Absolutely. And I just realized I should have like grabbed your book and put it like on the shelf behind me or something like that.
Oh, oh, you're absolutely right.
Hmm.
That would have been spot on. Um, so thank you everyone or people who are joining us. Please feel free during our discussion to comment on the Facebook Live because we can actually read the comments. We can Denzel in his younger years. Oh wow, you got it. What a
All right.
compliment,
Thank
man.
you.
Um, we'll read your comments, we'll answer questions. If for whatever reason you're not able to watch live and are watching this later, please still feel free to put in comments and questions, and Derrick or I will get back and answer them as quickly as we can because we don't want anyone to have their questions go unanswered. So, Derrick, now that I've told everyone a little bit about myself, if you could give us a brief introduction of yourself and background.
Yeah. So
Yes.
I'm a social worker who became a police officer, believe it or not. And so for the last 14 years, I've been the director at the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office, kind of helping to run the sheriff's office. I know oftentimes people wonder like how that happened and how social work and police work, people are getting used to social work and police work now, but I remind folks 14 years ago, there were very few, if anybody, doing this level of work around like how you blend those two worlds together. But that's really been my job. A lot of people see me on television because I get to share the stories of what's going on around town, and they think like that's the primary part of my job. But actually, the primary piece of my job has been like understanding the sheriff's office, the modern day construct of policing, deconstructing it, and then putting it back together. And so there's quite a few different ways we've been able to do that over the years. And now my boss, Jerry Clayton, who, by the way, is the longest serving sheriff we've had in our county's history, has decided to retire. He's earned that. And now that he's decided to retire, we are putting our name forward to run for sheriff. And so we'll be on the ballot for the August and November of 2024 election.
Yeah, and I know a few people are like, "Why are you talking about this so soon, Nicole?" The election isn't until 2024, but it will be here before we know it. Things go fast, and I want people to have the information and education early on about the different candidates who are running for sheriff and also their viewpoints on domestic violence. Um, and that's specifically what we're going to be talking about tonight. I know that every candidate has different platforms and ideas for all sorts of different things when running, but domestic violence gets overlooked often. People don't talk about it. It is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And Derrick, you know very well my frustrations with my own personal cases in the past that I've had with some responding officers, the legal system in general, not even the sheriff's department, but just the judicial system in handling my own and other victims.
Absolutely.
domestic violence related crimes in our county. So I want to make sure we are really putting a spotlight on that because not very many people do. So I think that's my job to put a
Yeah.
spotlight on domestic violence. So,
Yeah,
and
absolutely. If I could just say too, because I think that we met years ago, right? Like, how many times have either I called you or you called me, like with these frustrations, or we don't have any other resources or any options? And so, hey, Nicole, can you help us? So this back and forth. And I say that because I often like to start with some factual stuff around these conversations. Like, oftentimes, you said it, candidates have all these platforms and all these promises. What I keep telling people is what we're going to talk about is what we've been doing for the last 14 years, right? And then our vision for the future. So people can come on your show with you and make all kind of statements around, here's what I would do or could do with your support. I keep saying to folks, like, just ask them one question. What have you actually done that's going to prove to me you're capable of accomplishing what you're promising? And so I start with that because I told you earlier I was going to ask you, like, how did we actually meet? And I remember this story of, like, I was teaching a class, right? I think around like active shooter or something. And I'm sharing
yeah,
a part of a story. And it happens to be your story. You're in the classroom. And then at the break, you come up to me and you're like, that's my story. So we had never met prior to that, but those are years ago.
right.
And so for me, like, this isn't just, oh, I'm running for office, let me get on with Nicole and share some talking points. Like, this is the work we've been doing for years now.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was ironic. And to be in an Alice active shooter training and have your case example used when your school building had to go on lockdown because there was an active threat. Like I can laugh about it now, and anyone who knows me well knows that I deal with things with humor because I have to. And Anne Hockenberry, I know who's watching right now, was there for it because she was a teacher in the building at the time, so she lived through that experience live with me. But yeah, absolutely. And since we connected, Derrick, I know we've gone back and forth and talked about trying to help a lot of other victims in cases when we've both been bumping our heads against the wall of what to do
Yeah.
in different situations. And I love that you think I'm running for office because I know she's one of the many people who keep trying to get me to run. I would get kicked out of office, y'all, because I would be completely inappropriate. I wouldn't make it. Because I just say what's on my mind. So
I
I
would
love that
watch
people.
every single board meeting because folks who don't know you, that would be made for TV right there.
It would be entertaining for sure,
Yes.
but I don't know how long I'd actually last. Good evening, everyone else who's commenting. Thank you guys so much for being here and joining us on our conversation. So let's get down to there's Yolene. Well, you should, Nicole Beverly. See, okay, you guys. All right, you're gonna work with me. We'll talk about that after. Definitely not running for sheriff, so don't worry, Derrick. I won't be joining this election and running against you. But let's get down to the nitty gritty. We know domestic violence is an epidemic and it does impact many across the nation and in our own community. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men will be victims of domestic violence in their lifetime. Domestic violence does not discriminate, regardless of age, gender, sex, sexuality, income level. There was just, in fact, this morning I posted a young woman who was murdered in Flint, whose ex-boyfriend was a doctor.
Mhm.
And he murdered her, and then he actually did kill himself and with suicide. But it impacts everybody, and we know this. So let's get to talking about the nitty gritty and what you see as the biggest problems in our county and how you would tackle them.
Yeah, I think you just said it though, right? Like, there are so many calls around domestic violence. We know that for officers, it's one of the most lethal situations to go to. Um, we know that recidivism for those who are abusers is through the roof. You put all those things together, and you would think that we would pay a lot more attention to domestic violence. And when I say we, I mean like the larger community. Um, and so for me, I think a big part of it is making sure that we highlight and make domestic violence a primary focus. And here's why. we know that young people who are in an abusive household when they're young, at 4 or 5 years old, 10 to 15 years later, it is very likely that they might wind up being violent and aggressive. And when we started pulling some of our data, and we look at those folks who are like some of the most violent, like our shooters, attempt murderers and murderers, some of these young folks, when we look back at their history, like every interaction they've had with police, when you track it all the way back, many of them, a very high percentage of them, grew up in a household with serious assault or domestic violence. And so for me, it's a long-term strategy as well as it is a short-term around the folks who are, surviving this crisis, but also just the officers in general and having to go to these very dangerous calls. And again, thinking about the long term. So, one of the things that I've been talking a lot about lately is street level interpersonal gun violence, right? One person shooting another person. And again, when you start to track those young people back, there is a common theme there. Aggravated assault or domestic violence in the household. And so when we first started that kind of gun violence work, some folks were yelling from the top of their lungs, like, wait a minute, you can't forget about domestic violence. And so we started going down this path around these 14 points around how you deal with gun violence on our streets. You can't forget about domestic violence. And so we keep coming back to this is at the core of so many larger violent issues in our community. And so it just makes sense, right? The number of cases we have in our community, the lethality of those cases, the recidivism rate, the dangerousness for officers, and the long-term impact. For those 5 reasons, it is a no-brainer that we have to make domestic violence a bigger priority than we have, not just in Washtenaw County, but literally across the state and across the country.
Absolutely. And, I'm just going to take it a step further. From all the research that I've done through my work is we know that children who are exposed to domestic violence are more likely to drop out of high school. They're more likely to have failing grades. They're more likely to have attendance issues. They're more likely to complete suicide. They're more likely to have depression and anxiety, and they're much more likely, 90% more likely to become victims and or perpetrators of domestic violence if intervention doesn't happen. And they don't get some type of help or education on prevention of dating violence. And we know 1 in 3 high school students is already a victim of dating violence in our own community. And I'm doing the work in our high schools and collecting the data that shows, in fact, 43 to 46% of students in the high schools that we've presented at are already impacted by dating violence.
So here's a question for you for juveniles, because I only have a couple of years that the data that I was just pulling and looking at. Is that trend going up for juveniles like it is just for the general population?
In terms of the dating violence rates?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. It's increasing. It's a steady increase of teens being impacted by dating violence, unfortunately. Just like every domestic violence is rising, domestic violence related homicides are rising, and teen dating violence rates are rising. So clearly, like I keep shouting from the rooftops, we're not doing something right when we continue to see things going in the opposite direction of what we want them to. So what do we do? How can we really create true change and impact this epidemic? And as sheriff, like, what are some of the strategies? What are your ideas moving forward to really, oh, sorry, I'm reading. There are some comments. Let's make sure that I want to make sure we're addressing questions. I think people are just maybe kind of what education would you consider? Oh, okay. So Yolene, hold tight on that one, because I think that might be coming up. Derrick, she's asking about education for officers, which is an excellent question. So I'll let you talk first about, like, what are your ideas? What, if you're elected as sheriff of Washtenaw County, what are some of the things that you want to implement and put in place?
Yeah. So can I just mention one other data point really fast, and then I definitely will get to it. And Yolene, you might have seen my little bullet points because that's one of the first questions I wanted to talk about. So we hired this epidemiologist at the sheriff's office recently. An epidemiologist, studies diseases. And I won't go into all the details because we haven't released the data yet. I'll let the sheriff do that. But one thing in particular, she took all of our crime data since 2008, which is right around the time that Sheriff Clayton came to office that I started. And what we started to see is that there's been a steady increase, like you just said, around homicides related to domestic violence. So of those individuals who have been attempted to be murdered, some a victim of attempt murder, or who have been murdered, there's been a 44% increase from the beginning of the decade to the end of the decade that around homicides involving intimate partner. So when you start to think about that, I didn't mention it earlier, but I wanted to stress that as you talk about data, because it isn't just, oh, Derrick and Nicole all of a sudden want to talk about this issue. We literally have the data, as you were pointing out in your research, that is showing like the issue is getting worse, not better, in spite of us infusing resources into all these other areas like mental health and addiction and some of those things and reentry work. Something we're not doing is still allowing the most violent and the most dangerous situations to continue to creep up. So I just wanted to reference that as we get into the solutions. I think the first one is what we've been. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was saying no, and I am so glad that we now, because it's stuff that as advocates we've been preaching, but now you have data backing it.
Yes.
Right. So to have the data that backs what we've been saying for so long is critical.
And for us, the data shares a lot, right? Like that was even an example before we get into these of what we're going to do. But when I started at the sheriff's office, remember a social work mindset coming into, let's just say the jail always looked at recidivism as someone coming back, right? But then you take a social work perspective, you look at that very same data, but from a different perspective. So the simple question I asked was, wait a minute, someone's coming back 6, 7, 8, or 9 times. If you were violent and you came back 6 times, you would have been in prison already. What brings you back to a county jail 6 or 7 times? And just by asking the question a little bit different and looking at the data differently, what we started to see was we are one of the largest mental health providers. We're one of the largest homeless shelters. We're one of the largest addiction providers in our jail. We shouldn't be, but we are. And so again, just asking and looking at the data slightly different. So we started looking at not just from those we arrested around domestic violence, but started looking at those who were survivors or witnesses. And it starts to paint a very different picture for us. So again, imagine that young person. If we can say 40% of the young people who grew up in a pretty abusive household wind up turning into those individuals that are pulling the gun on our streets, that says something to us as a community. Now that data can really drive funding, can drive resources, can drive attention. And that's part of what this conversation and what we want to do at the sheriff's office is, how do we make domestic violence a top priority? Not just by words, but by deeds. We did it around gun violence. People are paying attention to gun violence different in Washtenaw County. We did it around mental health. The simple fact of mental health being a public safety issue. Now we have a mental health and public safety millage where there's like $18 million a year coming into both spaces. Why can't we not do the exact same thing around domestic violence, right? And so that's the first thing for me is as sheriff sitting in that seat to literally make domestic violence a top priority. And for me, anybody who knows me knows that, I'm a girl dad, right? So I got 3 daughters. So it becomes personal, right? I think about 1 in 3 women. I got 3 daughters, 1 in 3. That means one of them might likely be involved in some abusive relationship, right? Maybe all 3. And so when I think about that, I cringe at my core to think about someone harming my daughter like that. So for me, it is a personal thing on top of what I've been able to see at work. So that's number one, is just to really use the platform of sheriff to start honing in and making sure people understand it's connected to all these different things that are out there. I can keep going because I can talk forever.
Yeah. We'll keep going to the next one.
Yeah. So number 2 is what you brought up, Yolene. I think I didn't read through the whole question, but it was around training. So, we talked about like implement trauma-informed practice, but it's really about officers getting the right kind of training. So having folks like Nicole or other folks with lived experience, those and kind of survivor-led trainings for officers, because one thing to do a check the box training where I learn a little bit about domestic violence. I'm telling you, it is totally different to have that experiential learning where someone like Nicole, you come in and share your story, right? And a lot of our officers, or some of them, are going to know your story because some of them worked, pieces of the case, and now they can add into from their perspective what happened, and that helps our younger officers fully understand the trauma that goes on with domestic violence, the real issues of why it is so dangerous at the point of getting ready to leave. People assume like, well, why doesn't she just leave, right? Like having you or folks in your network really share that information so that the officers really feel it. The next time they're dealing with someone on the street, they're thinking about Nicole's story. To me, that is a huge impact around why we need really specific enhanced officer training. The way I look at it is just like we do mental health. We have all of our officers who train in basic understanding of triaging for mental health. And then we have a smaller group of officers that are like the experts around mental health. And then we have even a more specialized unit like our co-response unit with a social worker and an officer who respond to these cases. I want to do the same thing around domestic violence. Everyone has basic training. A certain group is actually well trained, especially trained. And then even deeper, we need a county-wide group that focuses on domestic violence. You can't just have one officer that gets all the domestic violence cases. It's too many of them. You can't just have the sheriff's office doing this work because we know the only people that know boundaries is us, right? Like the crime and where families move and bounce around to, we need a larger county-wide. Now, I can't do that by myself. So it would be me working with the other chiefs, but that would be number 3. So making it a priority, really improving and enhancing our training for our officers. And number 3 would be establishing this larger county-wide team. I'm going to pause there because I got 3 more, but I'll pause for a second.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things with deputies in Washtenaw County, even once we implemented lethality assessments, they were coming up against an issue when they're responding to calls and there was no place for victims to go. So I personally was getting calls from deputies that, had been involved with my cases in the past or who I've known and met through the work that I do now saying like, what do we do? Where do we send people? And I think I want to bring this up because as you said, people are so quick to say, why didn't they leave? When in fact, deputies are doing their job in a lot of cases, but there is nowhere for victims to go. And in fact, in our state, we're sending victims to Ohio and Indiana because of lack of safe shelter. So I know that's not something that you're going to be able to solve as sheriff, but I do think it's important to have, as these trainings are happening, for deputies to understand that there are going to be situations where no matter how hard they work and no matter what they do, the likelihood that there's not going to be a safe place for the victim to go before their perpetrator is released and $5 bond or whatever it's going to be. Sorry, I know that was sarcasm, but it's what we see so often. And they're right back out on the street and the victim's stuck. And then they have a decision to make. I can go couch surf if they don't have a family member who can take them in. I can become homeless, or I can stay with my abuser. And that's when your deputies are going to continue to get the repetitive calls from the same house, right? And are likely to get frustrated. And here's the cycle. Why don't they just leave? But there's nowhere for them to go. So I think it's critical that that's a part of the training.
Yeah,
Sorry,
but it's
giving you my
also,
input into your.
yeah, no. And I think there's 2 pieces I think that are really important to touch on that you brought up. Number 1, how does that isn't something the sheriff can control by himself or herself, right? You just can't. But again, I'll give you a real life example. Like I said, it isn't just about me making these promises. Let's look at real things. When we started to do the work around street level interpersonal gun violence, there wasn't a single program in our community that focused on it. There wasn't a single dollar being put into prevention. Now the county itself dumped in millions of dollars. The governor's office, not related to us, is putting in millions. The feds at the White House are putting in millions of dollars for this work. But in Washtenaw County, the sheriff's office started to talk differently about gun violence, honing in specifically on interpersonal retaliatory violence. And now the resources and the focus around public safety shifted to that work. So it's not something the sheriff can do alone, but a sheriff can damn sure shine a spotlight on it and say, like, this is a priority for our community because of all these different tentacles. And I think that's really, really an important component of it. The last part I'll say is you also made me think, like, how many times have I called you in all seriousness because a deputy is frustrated, has nowhere to take a person, doesn't know what to do. They by default will call me because they're like, all right, Derrick's in the office. He's a social worker who might know where things can go. Derrick, what do you have? And I'm like, Nicole Beverly, what do we have? And so
Mhm.
this is literally not just talking about it, but this is the work on an everyday basis of like, how do we help people get to the right place? So there are
Yeah.
some things that are here. I'll just say that the other thing on my list is I want to use sheriff's office dollars, some of the millage dollars, and invest in community-based solutions, right? And in recovery, we often talk about you got to have multiple pathways to recovery. I think in a domestic violence world, you need multiple pathways to safety. You can't just have one main resource in the
Absolutely.
county. You need that, but you also need all these other pathways because
Mhm.
some people are going to relate to Nicole and they need this grassroots effort. Some folks are going to want to go to safe house, right? And some people just need, I need a couple of dollars to go to the hotel for a couple of days so I can get out of town, right? And so investing in those multiple pathways is one of the things on there as well.
Real quick, I want to make sure I'm not missing questions and comments. Hi, everyone else who has joined us. Geraldine asked, when and where will we be able to see that data? Is there data on children involved in these DV crimes that will be helpful to support Cadence Law in Michigan? So Cadence Law, Derrick, just so you're aware, is a bill that's being worked on to help protect children with family court
Mhm.
battles and the judicial abuse that we continue to see happening to victims through family court by their abuser.
Yep.
So in terms of the data that you guys have collected, I know it would be helpful for Geraldine and the amazing work she's doing with Cadence
Yep.
Law. So I'm sure that's why she's asking.
Yeah, so I'll just say I'm not the sheriff yet, so I'm waiting on, the sheriff is actually, they're working on when we're going to announce, we're going to do what's called a community education series, and we will be rolling that data out for everyone to see. Along with that, there's a phenomenal dashboard that's coming out with a lot of the data that you can analyze yourself. So both of those, there'll be a couple of presentations that are being done on the what we're calling like witness survivor data, just looking at crime data from that survivor perspective. And so we haven't announced the dates yet, but they will be coming out soon. And I would say probably definitely probably in the next couple of weeks, we'll have a whole list of dates of when we're going to be doing those community education series.
Okay, excellent. And Geraldine, I did get your text. I will call you after we're done with the live. We're talking about how to implement judicial trainings for judges with Cadence Law. So that's a whole nother piece to the entire puzzle, right? Oh wow, we've got a few more comments or questions. So let's see. If we can help new parents with conflict resolution training early and continuing community classes possible. Sounds simplistic, but a stitch in time, absolutely. And Lynn, just so you know, I've totally forgot to mention, I do have a nonprofit organization. I'm so bad at promo for myself. I totally need a promo person called the Enough Initiative. And the work that we do is prevention and getting into high schools and college, and even as early as seventh, eighth grade, to teach the red flags to students of dating violence so that they can recognize them immediately when they are dating and get out of that relationship. And I also am going to be doing on November 14th, and I will be posting this on both the Enough Facebook page and my own Facebook page. But on November 14th, I'm going to be doing for parents a mental health parent education series webinar um, through the WISD. And I'm going to be focused on how parents can talk to their kids about dating violence and prepare them for dating to help them avoid that. And there'll be a QR code and other things that I'll be sharing. So it kind of goes along with what you're saying in conflict resolution training. Audrey's asking, is there support for the deputies' emotional strain incorporated in the training and department?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I'll just tell you that before I became a deputy as a social worker at the agency, this was the piece that started to get me, right? Like I started to understand the micro traumas that deputies are seeing every single day, and how they kind of build up over time. And we don't do well enough anywhere in the profession, including here at the sheriff's office. So separate from domestic violence, one of my other priorities is around officer wellness for this exact reason. We can put together all these great programs, these great trainings and oversight and all this stuff. But if we aren't helping the individual deal with the stress and the trauma, the way I like to describe it is any one of us that goes through something traumatic like natural human reaction is to build up these walls around ourselves to protect ourselves. And deputies are not immune to that, right? Like they start to see all these things every day, day in and day out. So they naturally build up this armor around themselves, which makes it harder. Like when you interact with them, they become RoboCop, right? Or they become insensitive in some ways. So to take that next step, I'm glad you asked that question. We have to invest in the secondary trauma and having officers really understand it. The other part related to this is that officers across the country have high rates of domestic violence themselves, right? And so some of this is just about helping the officer be well at home so they can be well at work, so they can be well out on the street when they're interacting with you. So great question. But right now we, I think, have changed the culture where we can start talking about these things as officers. We do something called ABLE, or active bystandership for law enforcement. And we've changed the very conversation around the thin blue line. So instead of the thin blue line being, oh, I'm just going to protect Nicole, my partner, it really is, I'm going to protect my partner, Nicole, but I protect her by making sure she doesn't step off the cliff and do something wrong, violate policy, the law, someone's civil rights, do something she shouldn't be doing even off work, working long shifts where she's driving home super, super tired versus resting at the office kind of a thing. So if I really care about Nicole, my partner, on the force, then I really need to make sure I'm doing everything I can as an officer. And so these things around domestic violence and people's personal lives start to fall into that. And all of our officers have been trained in ABLE. And I really do think it's starting to shift the culture. The other thing that's shifting the culture, honestly, is that the younger generation is just better at talking about this stuff, right? Like the new folks coming into the department are just better at being willing to talk about mental health. It's a part of the vernacular in ways that it wasn't even when I was younger. So I think that for those reasons, we need to be better, but it is slowly but surely getting better as the culture of the office changes.
And Derrick, since you are the one who brought it up, I'm gonna ask you this question because we do know that there is a very high percentage of domestic violence among police officers as a profession. The last look that I did, I know a lot between law enforcement and armed forces, the rates were quite high. If you were to find out if one of the deputies, someone in your department were to have a domestic violence conviction, what would happen to that person?
Yeah, I think there's major ramifications, right? Because not only is it a criminal thing, but obviously having a weapon, right? When there's certain domestic violence situations, they're going to take your weapons away. Like you can't have access to certain things, so it's going to be major implications for that individual. So since I've been there the last 14 years, we haven't had, at least to my knowledge, had an officer that has come through where this has been one of those situations. But any violation of the law by an officer is major, let alone being physically violent towards someone you're supposed to love, right? Like that even takes it even deeper. So just like any case, there's going to be an internal investigation. Folks are going to be off on leave while that investigation is going on. There's the criminal, which is separate, and then there's also our internal investigation. So even if someone criminally has either minor charges or doesn't, get convicted of something, there are still all kinds of policies internal, right? Conduct of what we expect from our officers. There could also be implications. So we would take them through our normal process, which is also part of what the collective bargaining agreement, that's a part of our disciplinary process. And I know sometimes that frustrates people to see like, well, there's this person in the news that's being accused of this crime. How are they still on admin leave, paid leave? Well, that's a part of our process, right? And we kind of go through and do our due diligence. But that's exactly what would happen. We would go through that same process for any case, and then at the end make our determination. But obviously people have lost their jobs before. So, it up into including someone losing employment. And the other part to that is, I think what you're seeing around the country, there's conversations around the state. Once that happens to someone, clearly if it's a criminal thing, it's on their record. So they go to apply to any other agency, it hits. But there's a lot of conversations around what happens if something, not just domestic violence, isn't on someone's criminal record and they lose employment. Like there's an internal thing. Can they just quit at the Washtenaw Sheriff's Office and then jump to Ann Arbor PD or Ypsi PD or somewhere else out of the county? And so that's, again, outside of the individual sheriff's office hands. But these are some of the things that we start talking about when we're talking about officer oversight and how we make sure that the profession is getting better overall.
So, Derrick, I just want to pause for 1 second because I see a question from Shannon McFall about maybe having a better understanding of your role
Mm,
as, and maybe it might be is good for you to share, like if you went through training, law
mm,
enforcement training, in addition to your role as community engagement officer.
yeah.
Um, yeah, if that could probably be helpful.
Yeah, I think for the most part, most people, again, they see me on television and say, "Oh, that's what he does. He's the public information officer." That's a part of my role. In 2012, I went to the police academy, not because I was required to. I was a civilian appointee, a political appointee. But similar to one of the questions earlier, we are talking about officers' mental health. As a social worker, I'm really interested and intrigued by mental health, and I started to see these micro traumas again. I won't bore you with the long-winded story, but there was a young person, a 2-year-old, that had drowned. And I show up to kind of do the media stuff, and everybody was gone. They were going to the hospital. All the officers had left. And so the officer who was there was going to do the death notification. He said, "Hey, director, I know you're new, but can you come on in with me? You don't have to say anything, but just listen." Long story short, I never thought about it, but guess who does death notifications? Officers. We're in the
Mhm.
house, and the kids who were at the house, when the aunt screamed, that's when she learned her nephew had died. The kids come running up. I rush downstairs and I'm meeting them, and one of them is about the same age as the kid who had drowned and had just died, and they're related. And so, ding, ding, ding. Lesson number two: like, this stuff is serious and heavy. And then we go to leave, and that longtime lieutenant who'd been doing this for like 20 years under his breath says, "I need to go see my kids." Lesson number three, like, doesn't matter how long you've been doing, it's like, this stuff is serious. And then I often ask, like, the officer who went to give mouth to mouth to that young person who pulled him out of the pool, guess what he did after that? He went back to work, right? And so for all those reasons, that was the one situation for me that really, I was like, I want to do this. Not just be a political appointee. Like, I want to be an officer. I want to blend these worlds wholeheartedly. So I often joke with Jerry, the current sheriff. People don't realize it, but he's never gone to the academy. He's not a police officer. He's the longest serving, most influential, one of the most influential sheriffs in the country. But people don't realize he came out of corrections, out of the jail. So Shannon, to your question, yeah, I came from a political appointee out of community engagement. Have I ever investigated like a traditional deputy on the street? Absolutely not. But Nicole can tell you, it's not me making it up, over the years, like how many cases we have worked on to help people get the help that they need, but also to help make sure that case gets treated the right way. And so we all have different roles. So my role has just been different. But I joke with some of our detectives and I say, uh, I've been at the center of literally getting some of the most dangerous people off the street. Not necessarily always smacking cuffs on them, but the relationship, the network, the ability to get people to turn themselves in or identified, that's been a part of my role. Most people don't know it. So it's a part of the campaign for me to share, like, what do I actually do day in and day out? That's what I do most of my time. Is I'm one of the front doors to the sheriff's office, not just through the jail or through a deputy on the road, but literally we've become one of the biggest doorways into accessing the sheriff's office for a number of different reasons. So, yeah, so that's what I get to do kind of every day.
Okay, thank you. And I think I know we paused for questions, but there are other things that you were going to mention in terms of how you would tackle the epidemic.
Yeah, so I'm just going to reiterate some of them, right? Make it a priority. The training for deputies, establish that DV workforce. There's something called the DV kind of review team, which it already exists. But I want to make sure that we are an intricate part of that and help to enhance that group, and not just domestic violence kind of death review team, but really looking at domestic violence, like some of the serious cases. So we're constantly learning, adapting, and getting better. There's more.
Keep them alive.
And yes, that's right. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Right. The other one is I want to create a PPO fund, a personal protection order fund. And it, I kind of learned this a while ago, but as I started looking at court documents and what it costs to serve a document, serving a PPO is one of the most expensive documents. So for those who don't know, you got to pay to get the PPO, and then you got to pay someone to serve it to the individual. because even though you may get it in court, until the individual, the abuser, gets it in their hand, it doesn't take effect, right? So you got to pay for someone to track them down. And because it's one of the more dangerous process server situations, it costs the most money. And it can be cost prohibitive. So I know we've talked about this, Nicole. Just think about how backwards we are. Someone is fighting for their life, and the system charges them money instead of putting the onus on the abuser. Right? It just doesn't even make any sense. So one of the things that we can do immediately at the sheriff's office is we can work with our vendor, and we can actually cover some of those costs and reduce the costs so that the survivor isn't the person having to pay that process serving fee. We work with a company, but the sheriff's office is responsible as a civil processor in the county. So they work with and for us. And so that's one of the things that I want to do, is to change that immediately, is like use our resources to make sure survivors don't have to pay those fees. For some, it may seem small, but even if it's just a small piece, it's something we can do to make sure that getting safety isn't cost prohibitive.
Yeah, I mean, that's been a huge, huge issue. It was, I was lucky enough to have a good job that I could afford to do those things. There was a instance of where my mom served my ex a PPO. I've served PPOs for other victims because of cost being an obstacle. I know, not probably the wisest decision always, but sometimes we got to do what we got to do to make sure we keep victims safe. And it's really unfortunate that the system has all these obstacles and blocks. And I've shared with you my goal. So maybe I will run, you guys. You guys are getting me all hyped up now. My goal is, to have it flipped where personal protection orders, once they're in place, that it's not, and they expire, it is not the victim's responsibility to file a motion to get it renewed, but instead for the perpetrator to have to file a motion to have it removed. So it just stays in place. And it's and the onus is transferred to who it should be put on. And that's the perpetrator, the abuser, not the victim, because we all know once those expire, first, there were instances in my own cases, as dangerous as my ex was, once he was incarcerated, that I would forget, and the PPO would expire, and then something crazy would happen, and our deputies would be like, Nicole, your PPO is expired, right? And I'd be like, oh my God, no. Like, I had no idea. So then there I was back at square one, having to file another motion, having to go back and explain why I needed this PPO, and having to file, pay money, even though he's in the prison. And luckily I was able to talk to the wardens now, right, and make sure he was served. But that should not be on victims to have to continue to do that, because what happens is they drop off, and as soon as they drop off, perpetrators come back, or once that motion is filed to reinstate a PPO or to continue it, you've stirred the hornet's nest, and you're back in danger. So sorry, that's my
your soapbox
for my campaign. But also, I agree,
traumatizing, right? Like that you put someone right back in that system. And we often talk about this. The cycle of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over and expecting different results. And so we wind up all throughout, not just the criminal justice system, but a lot of systems, doing these things because it's the process, but they make no sense. The first time you mentioned that to me, I was like, wait a minute. It's like a no-brainer. Why would we not do those things, right? Instead of doing the same thing over and over and over and having people be re-traumatized and re-victimized, kicking the hornet's nest, as you just said. So it makes perfect common sense to me.
We've got some more questions. Audrey is saying, unfortunately, there is another traumatic side to DV, and that is those women who end up protecting themselves. Absolutely. After history of abuse. Can you speak to how they should be approached? That's an excellent question. We see it all the time.
Yeah. So can you just share a little bit more when you say how they should be approached? And so give me a better context. I'm not quite.
So I don't want to speak for Audrey. So Audrey, if you want to type more in, but I'm imagining if someone is basically protecting themselves and using force in self-defense, and how would that be looked at? but Audrey, feel free to clarify more. I mean, we know statistically the number of women who are serving life sentences in
Mm.
prison in our own state when there have been very clear, documented episodes of domestic violence history, and yet and still the woman is serving a life sentence
Yeah.
when it's a clear-cut case of self-defense. So that might be what you're asking. In fact, I was just made aware of a woman who is serving a life sentence right down the street from us at Huron Valley, who had a well-documented history of domestic violence assaults against her
Yeah.
and defended herself, and now has a life sentence. So is there a different approach for victims?
Yeah. So here's what I'll say. So I'm not an attorney, Audrey. I'm not even trying to play one on television. So I don't really understand all of that. But I will just say this. Isn't this a part because we as a larger society don't really understand the full impact of what it means to be someone fighting for your life? That we don't really understand what it would be like, Nicole, to be in your shoes, to feel like the only way I can protect me and my children, right? Like people don't fully understand that. So not every single case of someone defending themselves is exactly the same. So don't hear me wrong. But I think part of it is we don't fully, as a society, recognize the real issue and the real danger that people are in as a survivor, of an everyday kind of survivor. And so I think that's a part of it. And again, goes back to the whole thing around why we have to make this a primary issue. We have to be able to talk about it. We have to make sure we elevate those voices that are closest to the problem. This is not rocket science. This is the exact same step-by-step model we've used for other issues. You take those people who are closest to the problem, they're always closest to the solution. Their stories and their voices are so powerful. You cannot debate a Nicole Beverly on what it's like to have someone trying to kill you, period. And so you can read the book, you can watch the movie, you can talk to her. The reality is it changes your perspective the more that you can listen to folks who are directly impacted. So I don't have a easy answer for you, Audrey, but I'll just say that to me, it does come down to we need to be better informed around what it means to be a survivor and live in that environment.
Yeah, and I don't know Audrey, but Audrey, I can tell you that I personally, because of my level of fear of my abuser, I did get my CPL. I did start taking self-defense classes, and I learned, through that I had to be prepared to act in self-defense and use that gun effectively. But that was a huge fear of mine. It was that I would be the one that was going to end up in prison for the rest of my life,
Mm.
because I did protect myself. But at that point in my life, I felt I had no other option but to get my CPL and carry. And it was very scary. And I know there are a lot of victims who live in that space, in that place, and it's a very frightening thing when you hear of cases of clear-cut self-defense. So I think that was a great question that you brought up.
And I know
Shannon is, oh, go ahead.
And I was gonna say one last piece. So I know this seems like far off and maybe panacea for the long-term strategy, but again, I take us all the way back to that young person who's growing up in a household and they're witnesses this behavior, and then they become the adult or the teen 15, 20 years later. If we don't fundamentally shift our thinking around domestic violence, so we do this thing called handle with care. It is anytime there's a young person involved in a traumatic situation and the deputy sees it and they're school age, they just do a handle with care notice. We got this whole back end system connected to all of our schools in the county and all the schools that are touching the county. And so little Derrick Jackson sees his dad get arrested. Guess what happens? That's traumatic for little Derrick Jackson. A simple handle with care notice goes to the school. And there's all these back end things that they can kick in if they need to. Why would we not look at domestic violence and that young person when we send that handle with care because they've been witnessing dad beat up on mom, that we don't not only just do the handle with care notice, but there's these other services that intentionally focus on that young person to help deal with the trauma that they're just witnessing, because we know the likelihood that that victim becomes a victimizer when they become an adult. So Audrey, I know that's a long way off of thinking about that person who has to arm themselves and defend themselves. But unless we're doing both at the same time, we never actually start to change this cycle of insanity.
Derrick, Shannon is asking you if you're willing to have a public debate with the other two candidates.
Hey, Shannon, you know your candidate is not on right now, but I'll just say this. I cannot wait. I can't wait. All right, I'm gonna let the inkster inside of me calm down for a second, but I cannot wait to have those conversations. So absolutely, yes, it's a candidacy. Of course, we're gonna have some debates.
Um, okay, so Ray is asking a question that I think I know the answer to this. Is if a victim would be referred to Delanis Center if they were a victim of domestic violence.
So I'm not quite sure what getting to, but I would just say we talked about it earlier, right? This is the reality of the limits of the resources we have when there's nowhere else to go in our community. So is Delano's the best place for someone who's in the midst of domestic violence? Heck no, it's not. But I think, should all have to acknowledge, like, we have limited places and resources. I think what you said earlier, Nicole, people are getting sent out like out of state, those kinds of things. So yeah. And so I think that's just the reality. So no, Delanis is not the best place. But if you have limited to no other options, it might be one of the options. But that's not on anyone's top 5 list of where someone should be going. That's for sure.
Well, and I have to say, even Delanis is full most of the time
That's true.
when we're trying to find places for victims to go. Um, it's just, it's the reality of what we're seeing right now in our county, in our state. And you guys, some of you, like, I see your name and it looks like there's going to be a comment, but there's like nothing showing up. It's happened a few times, so I apologize. There are some that we can't see. And Teresa, yeah, it's very limited resources. Everywhere's full, absolutely. So I mean, I think right now, again, this is like people watching. Help us, like, in Washtenaw County, like, what can we do? What do we need to create so that we have more places for victims to go, so they don't end up like we're going to continue to see a rise in the homicide rate if we don't come up with solutions. So, representatives who are watching, people who how many county commissioner meetings did I go to and I tried to get people to come with me and rally and be there with me, and I couldn't get anyone to come with me. And people will say, like, there's nowhere for people to go, but come out and advocate, stand with people and help our county understand that we need more resources.
Yeah.
If we're not being vocal and we're not talking about this stuff, like, we can type stuff on our keyboards all day, but if we're not actually out there and advocating, nothing's going to change.
Yeah. And I think the other part is, if we make the assumption because we have a safe house that that's all we need, that puts Safe House in a bad situation, right? Like, Safe House cannot solve this alone. Safe House is not the only place that people need to go or want to go. They don't even have, the space and the staffing to meet that. So it's not anything necessarily against one organization or the other. It's just, this is an all hands on deck, and we have to have multiple pathways. It's a huge problem. Absolutely.
It's a huge problem. Yeah, yes, everywhere's slow. Oh my goodness. Do you think that COVID made the domestic violence rates increase?
I'm not a social scientist who knows that for sure, but the data shows it, right? Like, so the data is the data. And who knows all of the ramifications of why, but you definitely know that during COVID time, you started seeing those numbers go up. So absolutely. And some people may not have been on earlier when I was talking about the homicide rate for women in particular related to domestic violence has steadily been going up, right, by 44%. So that's pretty significant. And I think COVID has a lot to do with it.
And I think, Lori, what we saw too was a lot of people, they were being abused, but they couldn't, because of COVID, like, they couldn't get the help that they needed because their abuser had even more control and power over them, right? So then when those restrictions lifted, we did see even like kind of a spike again when people could get out and actually let people know what was happening and reach out for help. But at the same time, Sorry, I'm trying not to read the while I'm talking. I'm getting distracted. But at the same time, the COVID restrictions were still in place. So then at that point in time, there were even fewer beds
Yeah.
in shelters like that. Like, luckily, thankfully, and hopefully we don't go back in that direction, right? That isn't as much of an impact. Terry saying in the county you're speaking of, are there any hotels, motels contracted to be safe houses? Great question, Terry. And Terry has a lot of experience with domestic violence shelter work.
So not in the like the hotel itself is for that. I mean, there is Safe House is what one of the organizations that is a shelter, and then there are individual, right? Like the county does have resources now where they're like one often, right? Nicole, like there's been a couple of times when we're like,
Yeah, there's
uh,
limited
yeah,
funding and limited funding through community mental health,
yeah,
Terry, here, but nothing that's really substantial to really meet the need. I would love that. Um, I think that would be, fantastic if we could at least if we could do something like that. But Derrick, to get back to your points, I know we're like running out of we've been all over the place. Sorry everyone, but your questions are
no,
great
you know
and
what?
your
We
comments are
made it through
great.
all six of them. We made it through all six. Make it a top priority in the county. Make sure we're training our deputies in all these special ways. Create that PPO fund. Establish the DV response task force, which is countywide investigation stuff. Enhance that debrief team that reviews domestic violence. And then the final one is about investing in community-based solutions, like using sheriff's office dollars to invest in probably some of the folks who are on the chat here who got great ideas and organizations, as you mentioned, some of them to do this work.
And I will say I was someone whose case was reviewed
Mm,
by I don't know, you probably don't know that, Derrick, but yeah, it was an interesting process. And I think it was very helpful to do a review of my case, and I was able to be present
mm,
during the review. And I think it was very helpful because it was able to see like where balls were dropped and things were missed in my case early on that maybe had they not been missed, things
yeah,
would have ended up being a little different of an outcome for me. Um, so that's something. And then there was also, in addition, something that was organized that I think was very helpful. And that was like a meeting when we knew my abuser was going to be released or thought he was going to be released. And it was a gathering of like law enforcement, parole officers, other county officials to safety plan.
mm. Yeah, yeah,
And I think that is something that is invaluable when you're dealing with very high lethality cases in our county to maybe help victims safety plan, because it's a very scary place to be in when you're being actively stalked.
absolutely.
Um, oh, I love your ideas, Lynn. Yes. Are there empty hospitals or jails? There are so many empty buildings in this county, from the university, empty schools. We got all the empty spaces. So yes, they could we've got the space. It's just going to take the funding to get them converted into safe spaces. If there are any churches happening to watch, pastors, priests, ministers, rabbis, Wiccan priestesses, I don't care. If you have space at your congregation for victims, that's another thing. Please comment, please reach out to me, because I need to know. The sheriff's department needs to know when their deputies are up against the wall with not having places for people like ready to go. If we have the more safe spaces we have to offer people, the better. So please reach out and let us know. And now I will add it right to the Enough Initiative resource guide for the county of places people can contact when they're seeking safe shelter.
Mm-hmm.
Lori saying they're redoing her daughter's case because the ball was totally dropped in Genesee County. Stalking is scary. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And we see it, across the state and the country. Okay, I know we've just hit the hour mark. Is there anything, Derrick, that you would like to add? I know I'm going to share your website
I was going to say that. Yep. If we can share the website. The only other thing we talked about so much, it goes back to your very first statement around this doesn't know racial boundary lines or anything like that. I made the comment one time, I was talking out west in Washtenaw County. I said, it's relatively safe out here. And there was a woman who stopped me and she said, no, you don't know what goes on out here because the houses may be further apart. You may not have as many cases, but domestic violence out here is serious. And so she told me, she was like, please stop saying how safe it is because you really don't know. And I say that publicly because I learned a lesson that day. And so I told her, I was like, I'm going to start sharing that with folks because we often focus where there are large population centers and there are hotspots around this. But in particular for domestic violence, she wanted me to make sure everyone knows that we cannot forget about Western Washtenaw County because sometimes it's obviously there, but can be just as scary, if not scarier, because there's nobody there. Your neighbors may not hear what's going on, so nobody ever calls. So just something I wanted to point out as we end today. And I just thank you for the time. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about such an important issue.
So now I have another question. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of response rate, like in terms of domestic violence in our county, what percentage of calls is it making up for your deputies?
That's a good question. And I'll say, I don't know off the top of my head, kind of the most recent data of what it is. We get about, in our county as a whole, roughly 2,000 to 2,500 cases around domestic violence. But that's just the domestic violence category. I think I've talked to you in the past before, right? Like there are lots of things around like malicious destruction of property or, like even breaking and entering into someone's that isn't necessarily technically classified as domestic violence, but we both know that is domestic violence. So some of that is a little bit harder to know definitively if it's not categorized as like domestic assault or something like that. So I think it's definitely much more than that. I would say this. We are on a regular basis dealing with domestic violence cases. Someone is coming in the jail and out of the jail and back to the jail on a regular basis. So next time we talk, I'll get some hard data around domestic violence, but I'll just caution people when you see that, just know that data for all police agencies is missing all of those things that are related to domestic violence, but aren't necessarily categorized as specific domestic violence related.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that. And then the last thing I will, as an ask of you, as an advocate, and not saying that you do this now, it's just a general thing that when we're seeing homicides related to domestic violence, them being referred to as domestic disturbances and family arguments.
Hey, listen, y'all. So she tried to be nice online, but she didn't hit me up around what I said to the media before. And she didn't hit me. So listen, if y'all see, this is a public service announcement. If you see a patrol car, that's a Washtenaw County Sheriff's car, and it doesn't have a purple ribbon on it, hit me up before Nicole does. So we make sure that they all got those ribbons on it. So they should have them, Nicole.
Well, how much longer? Tomorrow is the last day of October.
Listen, we're gonna keep those things on there until they all fall off because
I'm pretty sure some of your deputies might be a little concerned about me driving around their whole vehicle to see if there's actually a purple ribbon on the vehicle or not.
Yes.
Like if I'm like chasing them down.
Yes.
They're probably like, what is going on with this crazy lady? So I let Derrick know right away if they're missing. But yes. So yeah, because we think awareness is huge, and victims knowing that deputies are on their side, I think is so important because there's intimidation.
As we close, I'll just say this: there was a reason I wanted to go at the end of the month, right? Because to me, it's not just about Domestic Violence Awareness Month. There's a reason we put the platform out at the end of the month so that people continue to talk about it beyond just October. And so it's symbolic in some ways. But for me, I wanted to really show the very first platform issue we're putting out for this campaign is around domestic violence, right? And we did it at the end of the month so people can continue to talk about domestic violence. And let's get into it. Let's have the debates and the conversations, but trying to do everything we can, not only through the campaign, but really through the work, to just show that this is bigger than politics. Some things are sacred. Some things are important. Saving a life, preventing abuse is such an important issue that some of these solutions don't wait until election. They get done now. So keep an eye out. Visit the website. Can't wait to continue this conversation. And thank you so much, Nicole, for the platform and for doing this.
Yeah. Thanks for being here, and I will absolutely volunteer as tribute to be one of the moderators at one of the debates.
Only if I can be the moderator at your debate when you run for
I
office.
would
Now
love to
the
throw out some
crowd
of the
has said you're going to
questions
run for office.
at the debate. Absolutely. That's a fair trade. So thank you so much for being here. I see some more comments. Ken, how you doing, Yolene? Bye. Thank you guys all so much for being here, asking amazing questions on your frigid October evening. And everyone go enjoy the Lions. They're going to win tonight. Right, guys? Right, Derrick?
No comment. I love the Lions, but I've had to take a step back from the Lions. I've had to take a step back from the Lions.
Okay.
I love them. I want to see them in the Super Bowl. Go Lions.
Okay.
Thanks for calling.
Have a good night. Bye.